All right, let's dive right in. We're going to talk about a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially when we talk about science, positivism. But here's the thing. I'm willing to bet that what you think it means, well, that's not even half the story.
No, really, just for a second, what pops into your head when you hear that word? Is it, something about thinking positive thoughts? Or does it conjure up an image of a scientist in a lab coat?
Yeah, for most of us, it's something like this, right? This picture of science as this really cold, hard, rigid thing. The idea that it's just the facts, ma'am, that only the numbers matter, that science delivers absolute, unshakable certainty, and that the goal is this pure, perfect objectivity where messy things like feelings or values have absolutely no place.
But that popular image, honestly, it's a total caricature. The real story of positivism is this fascinating, winding road that reveals a much more subtle and, frankly, way more interesting idea about what knowledge even is.
So here's how we're going to unpack this. First, we're going to tackle that myth head-on. Then we'll go back to the beginning, to Auguste Comte's original vision. We'll see how a group called the Vienna Circle basically built this philosophical fortress around the idea, then watch as some of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century started finding cracks in it, and finally see how all of that led to a much humbler, more realistic view of science.
Okay, first up, we have to get to the root of what Auguste Comte really meant by the word positive. And spoiler alert, it has absolutely nothing to do with being optimistic or cheerful. The clue is actually hiding in a place you might not expect, in legal and religious history.
Okay, check this out. Think about the phrase positive law. It's not natural law, something you figure out just by thinking about it. No, positive law is law that has been posited or straight up laid down by a king or a government. Same goes for a positive religion. It's based on a divine revelation, something that was given to people. So in both cases, positive just means given.
And that brings us to this guy, Auguste Comte, the man who really ran with the term. He had this big ambition. He wanted to create a science of society, what we now call sociology, that was based on what is given. And guess what the Latin word for given things is? Data. That was it. Comte's whole point was to base our knowledge on observable data, not just on wild speculation.
And this is where that modern stereotype just completely falls apart. Get this, Comte actually warned against becoming obsessed with math and social science. He wasn't some crude objectivist either. He totally got that our own minds are shaped by the society we live in. And his method was super flexible. It wasn't just experiments, it also included observation and, really importantly, historical comparison.
So you're probably asking, if Comte's original idea was so flexible, how on earth did we end up with this rigid, numbers-obsessed stereotype? Well, the story takes a sharp turn in the 1920s, with a group of philosophers who decided science needed some very, very strict new rules. Let me introduce you to the Vienna Circle. These guys were on a mission. They wanted to draw a big, thick, unmistakable line in the sand. On one side, you had real, legitimate, verifiable knowledge. In other words, science. And on the other side, everything else. Metaphysics, theology, ethics. They wanted to kick it all out of the knowledge club for good.
And their big weapon to do this was something called the verification principle. It was like a bouncer for ideas. For any statement to be considered meaningful, it had to pass one of two tests. Test 1. Is it analytic? Meaning, is it true just by definition, like a doe is a female deer? Okay, you're in. Test 2. Is it synthetic? Can you check it with your senses, like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius? Cool, you're in too. But if a statement failed both tests, well, they literally dismissed it as cognitive nonsense.
So the Vienna Circle built this incredible fortress of scientific certainty. It was impressive. But here's the thing about fortresses. They're never as impenetrable as they look. And it wasn't long before some of the 20th century's sharpest minds started finding some serious cracks in the foundation.
First up to bat was Karl Popper, and he just completely flipped the whole idea on its head. He said, look, the point of science isn't to prove theories true, because logically you can never be 100% certain. Instead, he argued, real science works by trying its absolute hardest to prove its own theories false. A theory is only scientific if it makes a bold claim that could, potentially, be shot down by evidence.
And the big takeaway from Popper is this, and it's huge. There is no such thing as final absolute proof in science. All of our scientific knowledge is provisional. It's just the best story we have right now, the one that survived every attempt we've made to destroy it. And it has to stay that way, forever open to being challenged and changed.
Then came Thomas Kuhn. He looked at the actual history of science and said, hang on, this doesn't look like a slow, steady march of progress at all. He saw that science operates inside these things he called paradigms, basically a shared set of beliefs and assumptions. And every now and then, these paradigms don't just get tweaked, they get totally overthrown in these massive, chaotic, scientific revolutions, like the wild shift from Newton's view of the universe to Einstein's.
Kuhn's brilliant insight was that science isn't some clean, logical process that happens in a vacuum. Nope, it's a deeply, fundamentally human activity. It's shaped by history, by the social cliques and pressures within the scientific community, by psychology, all of it. Suddenly that ideal of the perfectly detached, objective scientist starts to look a little bit, well, like a myth.
And if Kuhn put some cracks in the foundation, our next guy, Paul Feyerabend, pretty much took a sledgehammer to the whole thing with this line. He was known as the bad boy of the philosophy of science, and you can kind of see why.
Feyerabend's point was that if you really look at the history of science, the biggest breakthroughs often happened precisely when scientists broke the so-called rules of the scientific method. He argued there is no single method. Now, his motto, anything goes, sounds a little chaotic, right? But he wasn't arguing for sloppy science. He was making a radical case for freedom, that we shouldn't automatically put science on a pedestal above all other ways of knowing.
So, after these knockout critiques from Popper, Kuhn, and Feyerabend, that old, rigid fortress of logical positivism just couldn't hold up anymore, and in its place, something new began to grow. Something more sophisticated, more flexible, and honestly, a lot more humble.
And this is what he marched: post-positivism. It's the synthesis that came out of that whole epic debate. Post-positivists still believe in the rigorous mission of science, but they approach it with a deep sense of humility. So truth isn't seen as absolute anymore, but as probable, as the best approximation we have. Objectivity isn't something we can perfectly achieve, but it's a goal we constantly aim for, knowing we're always part of the equation. And knowledge isn't just out there waiting to be discovered, it's something we actively build together.
So if there's one big idea to take away, it's this. Post-positivism gives us a much more realistic way to think about science. It admits that our knowledge will always be imperfect, that we can never have that God's eye view of reality. But that doesn't mean we just throw our hands up and give up. It means we commit to the hard work of criticism, debate, and testing to build the most reliable knowledge we can.
And that journey, from this simple myth of absolute certainty to a much more complex and humble reality, leaves us with a really big question for our own lives. If there's no such thing as absolute, final scientific proof, how do we navigate the world? In a sea of information and misinformation, how do we decide what ideas and which people are actually worth trusting? It's a question that's more important now than ever before. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.